It's your man, the STL stranger, Umar Lee. I am here in South St. Louis. We just turned off of Cherokee Street, and I'm here with my man from the RFT, Danny, and I don't want to mispronounce your last name.
Smith. It's Wicentowski.
Wicentowski.
It's Wicentowski.
Wicentowski. It's a very difficult name to say. Would you say that?
It was. I've been told the best way to rhyme it, unfortunately, is Pissentowski.
Pissentowski.
Or maybe Missentowski.
Pissin', I'll remember.
Yeah.
So, were you ever teased about that name?
Amazingly, nobody ever came up with Pissentowski in middle school,
right.
And my girlfriend is in shock that nobody got that.
Well, you went to private school.
I did.
Jewish Orthodox school.
Yeah.
Well, kids, a lot of kids had long names.
There was a lot of material.
There was a lot of material there, trying to say. But now that you're here in this filthy world of ours in St. Louis, the filter's off. And
I find this world to be much. I like it a lot more than yeshiva.
You like it a lot more than yeshiva?
Put it at that, yeah.
Okay, there you go, yeshiva students. Alternative weekly writing is preferable to yeshiva. So, being directed here. So, Danny, how long you been in St. Louis?
I'm coming up on 5 years now.
Coming up on 5 years. So you came here in 2013.
Right.
And you were just getting your bearings, just getting your footing in St. Louis. And learning the city, right? Mm-hmm. And then Darren Wilson shoots and kills Michael Brown in Ferguson. And you were kind of thrust into this coverage, correct?
Yeah, I remember, the first time I met you was at some point in 2013, and you gave me your trademark North County taxi tour.
That's right.
Giving me the lay of the land of those North County neighborhoods, which information that became very relevant, about half a year later when we were both out there in Ferguson. That was really my first year on the job.
I gave that same tour to Jessica.
Yeah, so it was very good. I was definitely not ready for all the stuff that was going on during those protests and coverage, but it was quite an education way to start my professional career.
I have to say I saw Danny on many nights. I think one night we were behind a building contemplating jumping a fence because the streets were closed off and we wanted to see what was going on back there.
Yes, that was an intense night, and I think there was a moment where we had wandered into somebody's yard, and we had both of our hands on this fence, and we were contemplating whether we should go for this, and there's the sound of like a big dog. Right. And we both came to the conclusion that maybe we don't need to do this. We turned around.
We thought better of it.
Yeah.
For those that know me, knows that I am not a fan of dogs. I know this really hurts me with the European American women dating prospects, but I am not a fan of dogs, and I don't want to get bit or nothing like that. So, from afar. We were also in the car one night in Pine Lawn. Remember, there was a guy got ran over on his bicycle. Remember that?
We were on our way to an early morning press conference in Ferguson, and we were passing through there. Yeah, that was horrific. That
was a terrible scene. That was the press conference where at the old Northland Shopping Plaza, where they had commandeered to be the headquarters for the police response.
Yeah,
right?
That was one of those nights. I know that they had turned that place into a heavily defended compound.
That's right.
That was a very surreal night with the guy on the bike, and then going on there.
So since that time, you've done a lot of features, a lot of good stories. I've been following your career, following the RFT. I've been reading the RFT since really I was a kid, and Ray Hartman was, the publisher, and I've seen the highs and lows. I do think that with Jessica, whose name I can't pronounce, Lucenhop, I think. Lucenhop, and yourself, and there's consistently some good stuff in the RFT.
Oh, I appreciate that.
The story on the front page now with about the refugees, Syrian refugees, over on the west side in Old Alpha Gardens being victims of crime. Good stuff. And the best, of course, is my RFT online piece about changing the name of St. Louis to Obama, Missouri.
I don't know why people reacted so badly.
I don't know.
It was such a straightforward and reasonable angle to take.
I thought it was a good suggestion.
I think that's a good suggestion too.
But no one seemed to agree. So nationally right now, the big story out of St. Louis is our governor, Eric Greitens.
True.
Navy SEAL Eric Greitens.
Yes, that is legally changed his name, where you have to say Navy SEAL Eric Greitens.
And to follow him, just follow Twitter at Governor Greitens and get your old Eric Greitens. You'll see his mugshot right there. Have the national media reached out to you for that, or has that become something that they're looking at local journalists for information on? Or
well, it's interesting. You know, at RFT we're so small staff that we really cannot compete in this way. You know, in Ferguson we could just kind of, you know, we could just stay up awake longer and just get out there, and we were still only a few minutes away. But in this case, we can't get to Jeff City. We do not have the resources or connections. It's Jason Rosenbaum at NPR, who's doing an incredible job. The Kansas City Star,
right.
It is also, you know, has a serious presence in Jeff City, and they're the ones who have the
You can do a better job than the Missouri Times, probably.
Well, the Missouri Times is another thing. I don't have $50,000 to throw around to anybody,
there you go.
Let alone Al Watkins.
That's a requirement for journalism these days, I guess.
I think so, but you know, it's something that we've had difficulty covering, to be honest. We've had to sort of take the second day angles or try to package things in ways to try to get people to read them. I will say, you know, that watching the way particularly this has been reported and seeing the way that my editor, Sarah Fensky, has taken this, I have a lot of admiration for her standing up for the woman in this case, who has been variously described first as a mistress, and that descriptor became a lot more uncomfortable when we found out what happened on her first encounter with Eric Greitens, which is when she gets locked in this basement. And so I don't want to. I feel weird about calling her a mistress again, even though there seemed to have been some consensual interactions afterward. But the fact that she didn't want to be part of this story, and the fact that after this story broke, when KMOV wrote it, Sarah was the one who came out there and said, hey, we are ignoring the agency of this woman. We are treating this like a linear story where, you know, someone makes an allegation and now we're reckoning with it, where this was so much more complicated, and where this woman's decision-making was sort of taken out of her hands, and her ex-husband, this revenge fantasy of his, became a national story. And so I think, looking at that coverage, what Sarah did to write that story and to take some serious flack, I thought was really brave. I thought it was really, it was, you know, a really solid piece of journalism that gave people a perspective that they weren't understanding. And it was something that she was able to bring with her skills as a reporter and as a columnist. And I think, you know, I think that is the major contribution that I think we've made in the RFT there. For me, I have a whole bunch of photos I took of Eric Greitens wandering around the Jewish cemetery in University City.
Right.
And so my contribution has been mostly visual and getting some photos.
Was that picked up nationally?
That story?
Yeah.
The cemetery thing? Well, that was a big...
No, I know that was picked up, but I'm talking about your photo.
I don't know if my photos have. I know that some people have, you know, given Sarah her proper kudos for her writing. But I think most of us, like everybody else, is just kind of watching mouth agape at the interactions between Greitens, Kim Gardner's office, and this ongoing legal drama. For myself, I've written several long reported pieces on Kim Gardner's office, the circuit attorney's office.
Let's get before we get to that. I just want to back up to Greitens real quick.
Sure.
Well, first of all, I think the media has been pretty good overall with not using the name of the victim in this crime, or using the name of her ex-husband. I mean, I hear Bob Romanek saying the name, but other than that, I don't. So I think it's been pretty good. I think Sarah pretty much took the lead on that, to really taking people to task. But the Eric Greitens saga, to me, is fascinating. That 6 months ago, you have a guy with presidential ambitions who is described as a rising star in the Republican Party, who you're beginning to see on a regular basis on Fox News, who has a stellar resume, right? Even though some of that is under question by the New Yorker article out now about the Navy SEALs. To see him fall so rapidly from a rising star to a guy fighting for his freedom in his political career, you know, my gut tells me he's not going to get convicted, but that his political career is over. That's what my gut tells me. But isn't it amazing to see something happen so rapidly to somebody that looked like they had the wind at their sails?
I think it is, and I think also just watching the sort of this very cautious way that people have been trying to understand who this guy was from the moment that he, had that interview on the Daily Show. That was the first story I wrote, was when he announced his campaign for governor while on Jon Stewart's show. And from there, he became, I think, of all the people who have tried to do what Trump does so well, which is construct this palace of loyalty where everything that inside exists through his own force of personality and through his own very powerful and earnest ideology that he has, the sense of America, a sense of loyalty.
Does he have an earnest ideology?
He presents one, at least.
He presents one. Because I'm not so sure he has one. Or Trump, for
and
that
I think
matter.
that's, wondering, what's inside that empty suit. But seeing him build this thing from the ground up, and in a lot of ways the things that we laughed at, the political ad that he had where he's, just shooting a machine gun, his, when he talks about the military or police and the way that he's able to engage earnestly in something that has become a pillar of, I think, a lot of conservative voters, that they want to see that and they want to see a level of honesty and earnestness in that. And he's a fantastic public speaker. He's a fantastic writer. He's the published author. And so he has a lot of these skills. And what he's been able to do, if you look at his social media presence, which is where he does his primary public relations on his own, that is another universe, essentially. And looking through that, and which I've done, going past, just recently looked through the last 5 months of his social media posts and the way that people interact with who he is, there is something really uncanny about the loyalty that he engenders in people, and the way that he's sort of tried to lean in to a political situation that really should have annihilated 99% of any other candidate.
One of the similarities I see with Trump is, so you had a guy living in Central West End, a guy went to Parkway North, Jewish kid from Northwest St. Louis County, Rhodes Scholar, married to an academic, Sheena Greitens. I know for a fact that he eats at the finest restaurants in St. Louis and drinks the finest wines. He basically has nothing in common with his base. You know what I'm trying to say? So and the same thing with Donald Trump. Donald Trump's not a hunter. He's not a fisherman. He's not a NASCAR guy. Like, Trump Nation is very much demographically, culturally something different than Donald J. Trump. And in Missouri, very much different than Eric Greitens. So this construction of this narrative that they really believe in and buy, I think, is the important thing. And you alluded to that earlier. And
I think what that indicates is that his political magnetism isn't really about demographics, and it's not about the way, maybe even elitism. I think his ability to tap into the nature of people's relationship to police and to law enforcement, I think the thing that really stands out in my mind is, I know that he, during his campaign, he talked about that he would have done Ferguson differently, which is hard, for both of us to have covered it. It's hard to figure out what anybody, even though, Jay Nixon was lambasted, it's hard to figure out what a governor could have done differently. But what stands out in my mind was during the more recent Stockley protests, during, there was what really should be called a small-scale riot that happened in the Del Mar Loop, where a whole bunch of businesses had their windows broken in kind of 5 minutes. And this guy gets hauled away by the police, and Greitens tweets a video of it. And this is a guy who's being hauled away by like 4 cops. They've each got one of his limbs, and he said, cuffed him and caught him. Some bad.
Was Greitens there on the ground?
So Greitens wasn't on the ground, but the crazy thing is that this guy who got lifted away was a Washington University student who had showed up just, because he saw a bunch of armored vehicles going down there. He hadn't been one of the people who broke windows. He was charged with resisting arrest, I believe, because he wasn't really into being carried off. But Greitens was fundamentally wrong about what he did, but this is what he is able to, I think, present to voters. The sense of who is the us against them, the sense of who's defending police officers, who are those who have sacrificed for the military.
Right.
He's so able to do that, and he fills that role and all of his suits really well. He's got that look. He's got that that patent kind of demeanor.
I said back in 2014, I was on West Florissant during the height of the Ferguson protest. And I said, in 2016, we will see a presidential candidate who's going to come, who's going to promise law and order and the restoration of American values, like we see in 1968 with Richard Nixon. And it came in the form of Donald Trump. And you could argue that Eric Greitens is a part of that as well. Now before we move on from Greitens, I'll just say, just quick or brief yes or no. Do you think he exploited the whole cemetery situation?
Man, I have such a difficult time figuring out what even happened there.
Right.
Just, as
what I thought happened, by the way.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was a hate crime.
Yeah. I mean, again, just to retread, they ended up having a guy who confessed. He said he was a homeless black guy who was 30 odd years old,
fighting with somebody.
Said he was fighting. Said he was drunk. Said he was mad, and he pushed over 120 gravestones.
It's a little unbelievable.
It's a little unbelievable. The ground, having walked down that cemetery, the ground is very soft. It is very, very old.
Right.
I could see maybe if someone was really committed enough and just spent enough time.
Right.
I thought though that having Mike Pence feels like maybe the closest politician who has built a personality.
And they're tight.
Sort of. Yeah, they're very tight. They share former chiefs of staff. I don't think that Greitens exploited that, just because in that moment, Mike Pence called that anti-Semitism in that speech, and from what we know now, that at least wasn't the motivation. The effect, there were Jewish people there who felt terrible and felt that they had been attacked.
So there's that perception. Donald Trump is becoming president. Yeah. You see that alt-right on Twitter. Some of this alt-right is merging with anti-Semitic elements, and then you see the cemetery happen. And people are saying, is this going to be what life is like under Donald Trump?
I think those moments are very difficult to reckon with for the people it affects. We also had, I think a year before that, there was a spate of arsons in North City churches that turned out to be a mentally ill African-American man.
Right.
And so you had, but you also had, the members of those churches and those communities who were also wondering who would do this.
Right.
And so, I think those are incidents that happen quite, unfortunately. Often we had the spate of, JCCs and Jewish centers in St. Louis were getting these bomb threats called into them. It turns out those and many others around the country were the responsibility of an Israeli teenager.
Right. And of course, we had the shooting at the Kansas City JCC several years ago. And of course, I know you're too old to remember this. I mean, you're too young to remember this, but we did have a shooter that targeted synagogues and Jewish communities, I think in the late 70s, early 80s,
I think, though, if we're talking about, is Greitens exploiting an aspect of what we might call the culture war, I think, his focus on police and his ability...
That's the crux.
That's the crux. I think his ability to engage emotionally and that when people hear him, they don't... Because he has such an established history with this, and because he wrote about it, and because of his talents as a communicator, I think he does not come across so ham-fistedly as a lot of politicians
Poor Peter Kinder. Poor Peter Kinder. And so moving on, I want to talk about, you grew up in Milwaukee, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Milwaukee is a city not dissimilar from St. Louis, right?
True.
Midwestern city. It's a little colder. Jeffrey Dahmer's from there. Laverne and Shirley, Lenny and Squiggy.
Dahmer did a lot of his work in Madison, but
he did a lot of work in Madison.
We'll take credit for him too.
Okay. So the point is, there are some similarities to the cities, but generally the consensus is Milwaukee is a little more on the upswing than St. Louis. Would you agree with that?
It's hard for me to say, to be honest. So I ended up, going to boarding school when I was 14, and so I actually didn't in Chicago, in Cherokee. So I didn't spend a whole lot of time as an adult with a car and interested in current events. The interesting similarities, though, are there is that Wisconsin is a state with a very Republican governor, Scott Walker, who loves try to run for governor, flexes his muscles on a policy level. Ran for president. You're right.
Yeah.
Really attacked the collective bargaining and unions. And I think if you want to look at a comparison, Scott Walker has done a lot of things that I think Greitens wish he could do. Greitens has serious problems with his own party. He has gotten very difficult time getting cooperation from his own legislators. Scott Walker...
But he also wasn't seeking friends in the in Missouri.
True. I mean, maybe that's his own problem as well. Yeah. Scott Walker is a much more, I think, skilled politician that we've seen. Very contentious, but in Wisconsin, Milwaukee is generally a much more liberal city. It gets a lot. I was just over there, and I looked at newspapers, and you sort of see the same thing where you have rural communities and other places saying, why is the state spending so much money on Milwaukee? Why is all the crime in Milwaukee? You could just copy replace the names, and so that was a very pointed parallel that I could see there.
Are you all in on St. Louis at this point? Are you?
Man, I really love it.
Yeah.
And the longer you stick around in a place, the more sources I can find, the deeper the stories can be, the more knowledge base that I can frankly put together. And I'm, also honestly improving as a writer and as a reporter. And
so usually we get a writer like you, and they get good, and then they bounce to the East Coast. So I've been waiting to read the tweet. It was a great sadness in my heart that I've accepted the job. Well, not the Village Voice, because they went under, right?
Yeah, no, they haven't gone under. They're online only.
They're online. It was a great sadness. I'm joining the Village Voice or something like that.
I would say I'm committed to. I love finding stories. I find them to be they make me obsessive. They draw me in. I love the people that I'm meeting here, and Missouri. This area, there's urban stories. There are diverse stories. I get to drive out in the middle of Missouri and chase down some very strange stuff that happens in those small towns, and so the variety that comes in here is great. And the fact is, the tragedy of having fewer local papers statewide and the terrible hollowing out of local journalism means that there are more stories that I could ever conceivably want, and there are more stories that are being dropped by other papers that I could scrounge around in and find something fun.
What story have you written about here that you're most proud of?
Like here in St. Louis,
in St. Louis.
Oh, I think the one that I probably talked to, everybody who's known me, I probably talked their ears off, was in January, last January, I published a story I've been working on for a couple years about a hijacker, a guy named Martin McNally, who had hijacked a plane in St. Louis in 1972. And so he's living in South City. He was paroled after 37 years in prison. I managed to find him and interviewed him for a couple years until he got off parole. And so that was a true crime story. It was a story of a guy who sort of had personal heroism. He was a criminal. He was a liar. He did something unbelievable. He jumped out of this plane with $500,000. He tried to do the D.B. Cooper plan. He dropped the money. He managed to get away a bit. He goes to jail. He's then, in 1978, is then involved in an insane attempt to escape Marion Maximum Security Prison via a helicopter, which also failed. And so that story just had everything for me, and it was one of the longest things that I've written. And so that one I was very proud of.
Good piece.
Yeah, and so this.
Well, you've been telling me about it for like 2 years.
I know.
So I felt obligated to read every word. Yeah.
I appreciate it. But I think. Being at an all weekly and being at RFT, I've done some very kind of policy-looking stories, looking at the airport issue, whether this airport should be privatized in its operation, the efforts to legalize marijuana. I've done some. I get to do. Those are very kind of policy-oriented and have a lot of moving parts. But then over the summer, I got a call from Sarah Fensky, and she said, "Hey, we had a cover story that dropped out. Can you go ride in the World Naked Bike Ride and write about it?" And so on a 3-day
Did you ride in the World Naked Bike Ride?
I did. I wore a pink tutu and suspenders and underwear.
Yeah.
I did not go. I had to have some kind of modesty. But I got to write a really fun first-person piece, and the first time I got on a bike in like 5 years.
For non-St. Louisans, if you want to see a collection of pale, pasty-ass, unattractive white people, go to the World Naked Bike Ride.
Yeah, I'm a great representation of all three of those.
That's my PSA. That's my PSA. You're not going to see what you want.
You'd be surprised.
I'm playing the numbers. Playing the numbers.
Well, not to objectify anybody's bodies, but I would say if you were looking,
not objectifying, of
course. If you wanted, if you were thinking that if there are normative, attractive people who put work into the toning their glutes and stuff, they are there. They do exist.
They do exist.
You may also find a naked guy riding a bike that looks like a perfectly restored 1973 Buick somehow. So you'll get your mileage may vary.
All I'm gonna say is, if you could stay in the park next year, we have lovely parks, Forest Park, just right around the park.
People loved it. They lined the streets. It was like a parade.
I was honking.
You were
flipping off, honking. Yeah, so
you were yelling, "Think of the children."
Think of the children. Well, one of my other things is these are all kids. These Ladue kids, Chesterfield.
I will say that.
Why don't you do the bike ride in Ladue in Chesterfield? I think it's
Yeah, I would say though that I know that the organizers of that ride were unsure whether to do it this year, considering the Me Too movement and issues over harassment.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that bike ride has a lot of committed people who are committed to making it safe and have rules, and there are creeps who hang around at the fringes with cameras.
Absolutely.
And there
are creeps
in
the bikes.
Yeah, I do not seem to be creeps on the bikes, but I have talked to people.
I'm sure there are a few sliding in.
Yeah. I've heard of people, who hear comments about their bodies.
Yeah,
and so that's so that's
not
terrible,
nice.
and nobody should do that.
Right.
And so now you can't just have a nice, pure, naked bike ride and not have the rest of the world encroach.
I say talk to City of Chesterfield, see if they can get a green light, and they can go by and see the folks after the ride. It'd be a nice thing.
I think St. Charles.
St. Charles.
Although
Lake St. Louis.
those cobble streets that would not work
Lake
for
St.
bikes.
Louis would be a better one. Lake St. Louis. So after 5 years in St. Louis, are you generally pessimistic about the future of St. Louis, or do you think that this city has a bright future?
I think first of all, I think what I've got to see the last 5 years, and what I've seen of people, sort of the shifts in the political power here in St. Louis, particularly the people who came out of Ferguson and the activist groups who are now entering the political sphere and starting to flex their muscles, has been remarkable to see. You don't really get to see a changing of the guard or a changing of the political wind that often. And I think there's a lot of momentum for St. Louis to do something to change. I think, the things that makes it very difficult to have a lot of optimism is just the gravity of the county-city divide and so many political squabbles that go into why this region can't do things on its own. And it seems to be absolutely hobbling because we're no longer measuring, say, the actual municipal resources that this area has versus the policies it could be doing, and this, just disrupts everything, from trying to plan housing to tax or incremental financing, the way that we're giving developers tax money. I don't think it would solve everything, but you see
city-county merger.
City-county merger, that is. But I think, if there was, it seems like we're still telling the same story, chapter by chapter. And whether we're talking about fragmentation and leadership, it's so difficult to see the way that the divisions between the city and the county are played out racially and economically. It really divides this region in a way that encourages, I think, some of the worst tendencies in neighborhood squabbles and community and in political infighting.
Well, let me remind you that at the Board of Aldermen last week, every black member voted for the revote. Keep 28, and the Progressive Wave, which was supposed to be this multiracial coalition, all voted against it. Mm-hmm. So time has told you, Vince Samuel in 1881 came in as a progressive to move St. Louis past these things, and I'm pessimistic with regards to messianic politics and movements, and we'll see. Yeah. The newcomers have a way of becoming the establishment, especially when they have the complexion for the connection. So we'll see. Yeah.
It would be nice to see St. Louis get its feet under it a little bit and get some planning going, and we got
a line bike now. So.
We do, yeah. Why are we even talking about problems? We have line bike.
Right. And OLO or YOLO.
Can I say, and I know we were just talking about serious St. Louis future, but when line bike came out, I was trying to find a story to write about them, and I looked on their map and I saw that one of the line bikes appeared, in the GPS, appeared to be in the Mississippi. Yeah. And I started seeing people posting the same screenshots. So I went out on my work day, and I went out to the near North Riverfront to look for a line bike in the water.
In the river?
In the river. I could not find it. I ended up talking with line bike, and they said it was an error. But it was a really fun way to get out in that area, which I hadn't really walked around that lock.
You know what? Most of us don't get to go into Mississippi until we're murdered and dumped into Mississippi. So,
I managed to escape that.
You managed to escape that. Yeah. So you're living in Bevo now.
Yes.
Which is an area which was basically an old Southside Hoosier neighborhood. You still see some Hoosiers down there. And then it begins to receive a lot of African-American residents. And then, of course, becomes a hub for Bosnians. How would you describe this mix at this time and everybody getting along? Because we did have a tragic murder there a couple years ago.
So, what I've seen, I really love the sort of the cultural mixture there. I lived for a little bit in New York, and a lot of my life was spent living in a very homogenous cultural sort of community.
Skokie's not the hub of diversity for the Chicago Metro?
No, and so I really enjoy being able to see different cultures and smell different foods and hear some different languages. And
do you eat Bosnian food?
Not enough of it. I really should do more to do.
You don't have one you could recommend if anyone's.
What would it be?
Or I would say garbage, but I mean, I'm asking you. You live in Bevo.
I don't eat out a lot. I am a Philistine. I eat a lot of Hot Pockets and chips. I know, it's gross.
It's terrible, man.
For the folks at home, Umar's face just collapsed on itself.
You're losing a lot of progressive points with your readership.
I eat tacos and stuff, but that didn't help.
That didn't help either. They got to be organic tacos, tofu filling.
Yes. But what you mentioned this tragedy that happened in Bevo. I think this, and just for those listening, in 2014, still in the shadow of what happened in Ferguson, there were some really horrific murders that occurred targeting Bosnians. I think there was a man who was murdered with a hammer by several teenagers
in Bevo.
And so the Bevo community staged a march, and they said, our lives matter too. And I think that tension of immigrants being in a place and wanting to find out how much an area is invested in them. I think we're now seeing an interesting way with the Syrian refugees who have come in. I will say for Bevo, I have not seen that tension explode as we saw it there, where people were really worried that they weren't being protected and that they were fearful for their own lives and safety. And maybe this could be a way to talk about the Syrian.
Well, loss for the city of St. Louis is the Bosnians who began to come here in the 90s. They have, in breathtaking fashion, moved out to South County and Jefferson County. So there was a thought that Bosnians would politically control a couple of wards in St. Louis, that they would be a strong political force. And it doesn't look like that's going to pan out, because the middle-class Bosnians are rapidly in South County and Jefferson County. And what you see in places like Bevo, speaking in general terms, not altogether, or a more lower-income or newer population, heavily and with a lot of Roma, Gypsies in Bevo. So that's kind of the dynamic, which is interesting to see how it'll play out in 5 years. Now let's get on to the Syrians. Now, just to preface this, I was campaigning for the Syrians to come here for years. I met with Old North Restoration Group, Claire Wolf, several years ago, before anybody was talking about it, because I knew that this wave is coming. And I know Dar Jalal, the mosque in Florissant, Hazelwood area, were trying to buy the apartment complex next to the mosque to house the refugees. It didn't work out. And they ended up going to the old Alpha Gardens on the west side, Holdemont, 1100 and 1200 block of Holdemont. And the RFT front page is talking about some of the problems that they've incurred.
Yeah, that's our issue this week. It was written by one of our freelance writers, Robert. Well, now I'm going to be the one who can't pronounce the last name. Langolier.
That's my first hearing of this gentleman before.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the way this, I had written a story, a piece about the issues the Syrians were experiencing in Hodiamont. Is that
Holdemont.
Holdemont.
Yeah.
A lot of pronunciation.
Old Holdemont streetcar line. That's what Holdemont was famous for.
Yeah, and so I'd gone over there to speak with them, about the conditions. This was after they'd had a couple of their sons, young kids who were beaten up and had their bikes stolen and dealing with sort of some daily safety issues. And a woman in University City saw the story that I had written, a woman named Jenna Bauer, and she ended up holding a series of fundraisers.
Bueller, I believe.
Bueller, yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to give some support for these families, these large families that are being housed in very, very cheap apartments, and that are dealing with a lot of bugs and cockroaches and crime. There seem like there are cultural clashes happening there.
Alderman Boyd said the complex is just fine. The refugees need to stop eating on the floor. That's what he said. There's so many issues that are happening in that, in just that one story of, how are the people in the community reacting to these new people? How are the Syrians reacting to those around them? These are, refugees who are trying to learn their language, who are struggling with transportation to get to their jobs,
who are living with a lot of people in a small house.
And people think they get a lot more support than they do. Yeah. They basically get support for about 3 months.
Yeah.
And then they get very little.
Yeah, but it's, seeing some of the reactions from people who live in that neighborhood. And, when I was writing that, understanding that, the people there have to deal with the same violence, and a lot of them are in, levels of poverty that would also shock, I think, a lot of people to see what it's like to live like that. And so I think, there are a lot of intersecting issues in those stories, but I think, there is, when you take guests into your home, when you're a city that takes refugees into their area, there is a sense of responsibility and pride and, wanting to give them, if they're going to escape a place that was trying to kill them, we don't want them to think it would have been better for us to stay in Syria or to go to Jordan and not come to the United States. And so it's a very difficult thing to hear the sadness in their voices and the desperation that they're experiencing, and wishing they could have moments of peace, because that's what we wish we'd brought them here for.
Should the St. Louis media consumer, should they still look at the RFT as a go-to place every week or every day? There was a time when that was pretty common. Everyone said, "Hey, RFT," and then the reputation kind of declined somewhat over the course of years. Do you think the RFT is in a place right now where it's must-read, go-to media?
Oh, I wouldn't tell anybody you must read us. I think they should. I think you'll be less informed and less witty, and you'll have less scintillating conversation if you don't have the RFT fueling your knowledge and your city witticisms. But I think what Sarah Doyle Murphy, we are freelancers. I think the food writing is unmatched. With all great respect to Ian over at Post-Dispatch, who used to be RFT's food writer.
They never do rallies, man.
I think the stuff that we do is, I think we can, for some stories, we can be faster. We can swear in our headlines every once in a while.
Yeah.
I certainly think that with the comedic stylings of Daniel Hill, our music editor, who thankfully weighs in on many issues, I think we're definitely funnier, the funniest and most...
Funnier than the St. Louis Business Journal?
You get the worst trolls, too.
Yeah, I don't think, through all the respect to the Business Journal, I don't think they've ever untucked their shirts in their khaki pants. And I think we, at the RFT, have sort of more of the cultural milieu of somewhere between... between hipsters and juggalos, somewhere like there.
Have you ever been on Donnybrook yet?
No, I don't.
Sarah has.
They must have an age limit. I've wanted to be on there, but you got to be like I'm 28.
Yeah.
I've got to be at least. I've got to get like another decade or so.
You made it when you made it on Donnybrook.
I will not feel satisfied in my media life here until I'm on Donnybrook.
I have not been on the Donnybrook panel. I was the subject negatively of a Donnybrook segment.
Sure you were.
So it's come close to it. Now I want to say this about Danny before we go. When I first met him in 2013, he basically looked like a little kid. He looked like he was about 11 or 12 years old. But you were like 23 at the time or something like that. Yeah.
It was right out of college.
Yeah. So you've really aged a lot. I would suggest putting on a hat when you want to do a serious interview.
I was just in the mayor's office. They didn't kick me out for the blue hair.
Yeah, well, but lucky I didn't get elected to mayor. My candidacy was not successful.
I got it, yeah.
But he looks grown now. He's doing good work. I think your writing is improving. I thought you were a good writer at first, but obviously we can all improve. Mm-hmm. I mean, even myself, I go back and read old stuff and I say, I would have did that differently, or that's not really that good. And so writing is a craft, and it's all about getting better. And I think you're progressively getting better.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think we're fortunate to have you here in St. Louis. And I hope we can get you another 3 years at least.
Yeah, I hope, as good as I feel like RFT is doing, I hope we make it another 3 years. We were bought out by new owners in March 2015, and we're still going. It has been pretty rough for all weeklies all over the country.
It's tough.
Sarah Fenske, our editor-in-chief, had to watch what happened to the LA Weekly, her former gig. And,
that was nasty.
So
Belleville News just announced they're going to be printed out of Kansas City now. Right. I don't know how the logistics of that is going to work.
I don't know, but I feel so lucky and fortunate to be able to have this job and to keep improving in my reporting and deepening my understanding of the city and trying to, find, there's more stories that are being, untold and lost that we can find, and I'm hoping we can keep
joining us for Provell Appreciation Day. All right, how do people follow you on social media?
On the website, and Sometimes I get, featured on prestigious media outlets like the Umar Lee.
That's right. St. Louis Speaks, man.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, Danny Wicentowski.
Yes.
All right. I can't shake your hand because my whole.